Due Process, winner of 19 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2010 New York Emmy for our coverage of voting rights, and the 2011 Mid-Atlantic Emmy for Outstanding Discussion Series. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
This can be classified certainly as partly a civil rights demonstration.
The Newark mayor whose city went up in flames, one of scores of corrupt politicians he took down by the age of 36. Judge Herb Stern, once played in the movies by Martin Sheen, in private practice now for decades. But in his new book, Judge Stern takes us back to his glory days as one of the country's youngest, most successful government prosecutors, from the killers of Malcolm X to Newark's U.S Attorney. Judge Stern looks back on a legendary career as the tiger in the court on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.
Some prosecute, some do defense, some become judges. The exceptional may make it to the federal bench. Then there are those who do it all and more. A rare few even come to be called legend. Herb Stern has been one of those. Starting as a DA in New York, quickly rising to be the powerful U.S. Attorney for New Jersey, all less than a decade out of law school, with a string of spectacular cases that made him famous. He went on to become a federal judge, his most famous case tried not in New Jersey, but on U.S.-occupied German soil. It became a Hollywood movie starring Martin Sheen as the judge.
Are you telling me that the Constitution of the United States does not apply in this court?
Based on a book Stern wrote about his judgment in Berlin. It was the controversial case of a hijacked plane from East Berlin to West in the midst of the Cold War. But his new book, Diary of a DA, ends with his rise to the bench nearly 40 years ago, covering just a dozen years as a prosecutor, years that made him something of a legal legend, as he handled cases ranging from the murder of Malcolm X to the contra-indictments of Oliver North, to his assaults on both organized crime and official corruption. One earlier book about those exploits, one he didn't author, titled Tiger in the Court. It's a role that he'd revisit now and then, even after he was off the bench, not just with the North case, but most recently as the man appointed to monitor and stop corruption at the state's medical school. So the impending publication of Stern's book was all the excuse we needed to get him in the studio for a candid conversation with our Raymond Brown.
Herb Stern, it's good to have you with us.
Ray, it's an honor to be with you.
We'll talk about your book, your career. We always believe in biases disclosed here. So as I was reading the book, I came across your description of a guy named Raymond A. Brown, who you describe as the greatest cross-examiner in New Jersey. Of course, we think maybe the universe. And a particular episode in a famous case you tried involving the Jersey City 8. And yes. My dad was representing Mayor Whalen, and there was something about an ash can.
Yes. Well, we had one of our most important witnesses on the stand, Ray, and your dad was cross-examining him. He got him to admit that he had, of course, taken graft. And your dad said, well, where'd you keep the cash? And the witness said, well, I kept it in the basement. And he said, well, your father said, where in the basement? He said, well, I kept it in the trash can. So at the next recess, your dad comes in with a brand new, shiny trash can. And he puts it right in front of the witness, and he says, now tell us, how far down in the trash can did the money go? And he has him actually describe the level in which he had secreted the cash. Well, the guy's face was bright red, and I, as the prosecutor, was a very unhappy man, too. Your father was a magnificent cross-examiner.
Of course, to complete that story, it turns out there's something about Swiss bank accounts that may have scuttled the trial from a defense point of view.
Yes, yes. Well, we found it was actually, Ray, it was a Florida bank account which your dad's client, Mayor Whalen, had jointly with the president of the city council with $1,231,000 in it. Once we found that account, your father could have rivaled Demosthenes and it wouldn't have done any good. There's just no place for him to go.
And that case, I guess, was one of the highlights of a career as a United States Attorney where you looked pretty intensely at political corruption in the state of New Jersey.
Yes.
What caused you to move in a direction which many argue between yourself, Fred Lacey, and Jonathan Goldstein marked a unique era in prosecutions in the United States?
Well, we were convinced that the proper role of federal law enforcement was not to replicate what the state people do, and they do it very well. I mean, you know, to deal with bank robberies or burglaries or interstate thefts of cars would be really to waste what is a very small amount of resources that a federal prosecutor has. And so, using magnificent agencies like the IRS and the FBI, we went after the crime in the suites rather than crime in the streets.
Was your theory in part premised on the notion that sometimes local prosecutors might have ties, political or otherwise, to some of those figures and not be aggressive? Or
Well,
was
there was always some of that, but but you know, to be honest about it, that can occur in federal law enforcement too, because people don't spring from Zeus's brow. There's a political process and people get appointed normally in that way. The real issue is the resources that are available. I mean, the local police do an excellent job with local crimes, but they're not the best agency to investigate sophisticated money laundering and white-collar cases.
Now, I've jumped into the middle of your career, and that probably will mislead some folks who haven't followed all of it. But you were pretty young at the point where you were bringing indictments against mayors in Newark, Jersey City, and the famous Colonial Pipeline case in Middlesex County. How did you happen to be in a position of so much influence and so much, quite frankly, power, prosecutorial discretion, at the young age of being in your 30s?
Yeah, luck. I happened to be in the right place at the right time, and there was probably no more problematic place in the United States and New Jersey in terms of official corruption. It had been neglected for so many years. It was, you know, in Jersey City, your dad would have, I think, could have confirmed that it was an expression, a way of life. It's the way of life. Nobody worked in Jersey City who didn't tithe 10% to the organization. Newark was controlled by the mafia. You know, you have on TV today, this is memorialized. You look down at Atlantic City with Nucky Johnson, which is Boardwalk Empire. And the people.
And since you're mentioning TV, I have to mention The Sopranos, which some say is based on a man you prosecuted.
Yes. David Chase, who wrote it, has confirmed that the mobsters in Livingston who controlled Newark, Tony Boy Boyardo and his father, Richie the Boot, Gyp DiCarlo. Have you seen, Ray, have you seen Jersey Boys?
Yes.
You know, Gyp DiCarlo's a character in that play.
So what is it, now one of the issues that arises is whether there's something special about the culture of New Jersey or the economics of New Jersey that makes New Jersey different from other places, or whether it's just that there's been a tradition of vigorous prosecution, in part started during your tenure, that's unearthed more of it here than elsewhere.
You have a combination of problems. Number one, New Jersey really doesn't have a great big city like New York City. I think the largest city in New Jersey is probably under 400,000 people. You have roughly about 5,500 municipalities, all with their own organizations, all with their own rules and so forth and so on. That creates a problem because there's so much red tape, you know, to do anything, and that provides pressure points for corrupt politicians. It provides blockages for corrupt businessmen who want to get around the rules. The second problem that you've had is it was totally neglected. You had Boss Haig, who ruled in Jersey City.
But he only took 3%.
Well, there was inflation. Now, then it went to 10%.
Now, you were not, by the way, a Jersey guy.
No.
And in fact, I've jumped into the middle of the story, and I think we got to put it on pause for a minute and go back to the fact that this book starts with your career as a DA in Manhattan.
Yes, that's where I was born.
And you started out at the bottom of the totem pole,
Yes.
fielding complaints.
Yes.
One of the more interesting complaints that you had to jump on initially involved the death of Malcolm X.
Well, by then I was in the Homicide Bureau, and the way it worked is you had the duty. You know, we shared the duty. You had it for 24 hours, and it was Sunday afternoon. I remember I was single and bachelor, and
You were with a girl in a bar at the time.
yes, I was in a girl in a bar, and somebody said that Malcolm X was killed, and I realized I had the duty, so I had to get hoofing, get out there.
Now, New Jersey has a special interest in this because I think it's always been viewed historically that the assassins of Malcolm came from Newark and perhaps from the Newark Mosque number 7.
One of them.
Well, we're going to come to that. Manning Marable, a distinguished historian, earlier this year published a book in which he basically said that the shooter was a man from Newark who got away. Well, maybe leave his name alone because he's not been charged or convicted, but he's still living in Newark. And the allegation is that he got away and he was the man with the shotgun.
Well, that may be his point of view as a historian, but it wasn't the point of view of the witnesses in the ballroom who testified that it was a man named Johnson who had the shotgun, a man named Butler who had one pistol, and a man named Hagan who did come out of the mosque in Newark. He was caught at the scene, obviously.
But one of the limitations that you talked about, and by the way, you didn't try that case, but you were the first investigating DA on it.
Well, I indicted the case. I accused the man.
Was that your desire would be, as in any case, to get to the top.
Sure.
And also, one of the things that's interesting in the book is that there was an undercover cop that you were told about, never fully, you never interviewed him, belatedly in the investigation. And one of the things that Marable talks about is that the Nation of Islam, the Fruit of Islam, as well as Malcolm's organization were honeycombed with informants and people who had ties to law enforcement. That complicates the question of what happened and whether the full story was known at the time of those prosecutions.
Well, you know, for me, it's not very complicated. Malcolm was a dynamic, important figure who stood up in front of 200 to 300 people in a ballroom, got to say "Salam Alaikum," and then got blown away by 3 men holding weapons. Now, that isn't very complicated. The people who were convicted were identified by Malcolm's followers, who were witnesses in the ballroom.
But you indicated that maybe even more so than the other investigations, because you describe a number of investigations in detail in this case. It strikes me that because of many layers and levels of distrust, that this was one case where it was hard to penetrate to the heart, even of those who were very sympathetic to Malcolm and to the victims.
Well, if I gave that impression, then I have to take another look, because frankly, while we weren't well liked by Malcolm's followers and didn't expect to be, we did achieve a lot of cooperation, because at the beginning, in the shock and in the horror and misery of what occurred, his followers did want to bring the people who did it to justice. And you know, they immediately burned down the mosque in Harlem, which was the black Muslims. There was never any doubt in anybody's mind, certainly not in Malcolm's followers or family's mind, about where the assault had emanated from. We were unable, unfortunately, to get above the shooters because they wouldn't talk.
Now, one place where I think it's fair to say from your book you feel you got to the top was in the city of Newark.
Yes.
And this was after you had become the United States Attorney in Newark.
Yes.
And that was the case involving Hugh Addonizio.
Yes.
How did that case start?
Well, it really started when, in one sense, when the Afro-American population rioted in '67, and the governor appointed a Lilly Commission. I think your dad was vice chair or
Vice chair.
And the Lilly Commission found that one of the causes of the riots, and I think I'm quoting exactly, was, quote, a pervasive feeling of corruption, the notion that everything in City Hall had a price tag on it. And knowing your father as I did, he probably wrote those words. And this caused all the investigations to begin, and ultimately a fellow who was at the center of paying off ran to the feds, and we got involved. We came in September '69. By December 17th of '69, we had the whole city under, the administration under indictment with the mafia.
And you had tapes in that case.
No, well, it was actually the DiCarlo case, Ray, but the DiCarlo tapes spoke of the fact the mob elected Addonizio.
Were you shocked when you first were confronted with evidence that that was true?
It was appalling. It was appalling. I mean, look, on the one hand, these people are on the periphery. What do? They run gambling, which people make outlawed but want to do. And so, you know, they purvey themselves as providing services that people say they don't want, but really do want, and they're harmless. But these folks weren't harmless because what they did was they took over the actual bidding process in the city.
Would you be surprised that there are people still in Newark who talk about the boast that Addonizio made about his ability to make money illegally in Newark on tapes and elsewhere?
You know where he wound up.
Now, you had a tough decision to make because there was a change in the body politic, and there was a guy about to run for mayor against Addonizio, a guy named Mr. Gibson, who would have been the first black mayor. Did you have to make a judgment about whether an indictment, which could not necessarily come to trial before the election, should be handed down against the sitting mayor who's also going to run?
I'm very clear on one thing, and I disagree with many people who were in office or are still in office as prosecutors. To withhold an indictment which you otherwise could bring for fear of influencing an election influences an election. In other words, if you indict, it may influence an election, but if you could indict and you don't, that influences an election too. So to me, the only proper consideration for a prosecutor is, do I have enough to indict? And frankly, I always err on the side of, or at least I did when I did that work, of informing the public.
Did the procedures in the Department of Justice at the time require that you go to Washington for a decision like that, or was that one you could make on your own?
No, you couldn't. You know, this was a major indicting the administration in league with the mafia. I had to go down there and sell it, but we did. You know, we did. And I believe, you know, if you know these things and you can
But
prove
is that view universally held, the view that you should indict if you have the evidence, and if it has political consequences, they should just chips fall as they may? Is that a universally subscribed to view?
No, as I say, I think it is not. And, you know, maybe it's safer for prosecutors to withhold it on the grounds that they otherwise would be accused of interfering. There was never any prosecution we brought in which we weren't accused of something. You know, we had Congressman Gallagher. He accused us of being like Nazis. We were always accused. The Republicans accused us of being the agents of the Democrats. The Democrats accused us of being the agents. But that's not my business.
But does power like that ever lead to hubris? The reason I ask that is that when you mention the decision to go from being the prosecutor to a judge, you say one of the several reasons you didn't run for political office was that you would not like people to believe that you were ever motivated by personal ambition in terms of partisan politics in the indictments that you brought. Does that mean that you think that's a potential danger in having prosecutors with the power they do if they also have political ambition?
There's nothing pure in life. There have been great prosecutors who ran for higher office and did very well. Tom Dewey in New York became governor of New York and twice presidential candidate. He was a magnificent prosecutor. People don't even remember that Bob Morgenthau in New York ran for governor against Nelson Rockefeller. He didn't do very well, did better as a prosecutor. There is a natural, it's a matter of personal taste, and I have no criticism for any prosecutor who seeks elective office. But it wasn't for me.
But is there a danger in that nexus that people will see it as, I mean, the obvious, not to waltz around it, we have a governor now who was an United States attorney, presided over some pretty controversial indictments and cases that some have said were politically motivated. Had he not run for office, the conversation might involve a critique of his work, but it wouldn't involve the allegation of political motivation. Does that affect the body politic?
Well, what are you going to do? Emasculate people who, who are successful prosecutors? It doesn't make a lot of sense. People move from position to position, and those who want to impugn improper motives will do so no matter what you do. You could say that I did it to become a federal judge if you wanted to. There comes a point where, you know, you just have to use the I don't give a damn. I'm going to get you if you were wrong. You can call me whatever you want. But if I convict you, then like Humphrey says to Ingrid, here's looking at you, kid.
Was it satisfying moving onto a judgeship from all the action that you had been in the center of as a U.S. Attorney to being a judge, which is a whole different universe?
Well, I got a lot of criticism being a judge because I was pretty activistic there, too.
That's true. And I should mention that I tried my first federal criminal case in front of you many years ago. But you also did something else that's very unusual, talking about the blend of politics and law, which was to sit on a court that you had, in fact, you wrote a book about this, involving the delicate relationship between the United States, West Germany, Poland, and East Germany to deal with hijacking.
Yeah.
Was that a circumstance where you were aware of the political and diplomatic backdrop to your work as a judge?
You could not be aware of it. People don't realize, you know, I'm the last person to have sat on such a court until Guantanamo. It's the same court. And it was the same issues. The issues before me were whether or not the Constitution of the United States applied. I saw that.
I should be interviewing Martin Sheen for this part.
He would do much better than I would.
Do you see any parallels between that experience and Guantanamo? Anything we can learn about Guantanamo from your experience sitting on as a judge on the only case that was ever tried by that court for hijacking?
Yeah, well, after I was finished, they shut it down forever. But the point is, it's the same concept. When the United States sits in judgment, even if it sits in Berlin or Guantanamo, does the Constitution of the United States apply, in whole or in part? We answered that question back in 1980, and I said, yes, it does. And we're still struggling with that today, although the circumstances are somewhat different because this was an occupation court which was really performing a civil function of which normally a sovereign does, but we were in occupation status in Berlin. Whereas in Guantanamo, these people are being tried under the laws of war. So the parallels are not perfect, but the issues
And the Supreme Court has wrestled with that, both in terms of the impact of the laws of war and the question of extraterritoriality.
Yes, and they have found that there is a right of habeas corpus. They have found that there are limits on the authority. You can't have a government with no limits.
Now, you were known as a tough sentencer. I think you will agree to that. Certainly the defense bar, of which I
agreeing to
was
nothing.
a remaining member, said that. On the other hand, we have now something called the sentencing guidelines that seriously constrain what judges can do. Effectively, it makes the Department of Justice and the United States attorneys the sentencing scheme.
Yes.
What do you think about the guidelines? Do you think they work? Have they enhanced the quality of criminal justice?
Well, it's a very broad topic for about 2 more minutes we have, but I think that they have not worked. I think that the Supreme Court pulled back from them. I think clearly the Congress intended that they should be mandatory. I think the Supreme Court has, after about 25 years, tried to liberate the trial courts. I think they do transfer the sentencing power to the U.S. attorneys because they become the power to charge and draft a charge and craft a charge becomes, in effect, the power to sentence. I don't think that that is appropriate.
If you were sitting now, would you find it frustrating to be constrained by the guidelines to the extent that they apply in current cases?
Well, I would, except that given the movement of the law over the past 25 years to pull back the constraints on the sentencing judges, a sentencing judge today who understands the guidelines he or she can mold a sentence according to conscience rather than edict.
To give you one other unfair question, while we were walking in, you mentioned in the realm of prosecuting corporations that you might encourage us to rethink the notion of prosecuting corporations as opposed to those who make the decision, at least as the public corporations.
Well, in terms of public corporations, when you I'm not in favor of letting anybody go. But if you prosecute a public corporation, you are punishing the existing shareholders. But if you do that and let the individuals in the corporation who have caused the harm go, I do not understand that. The corporations, just write a check, and then they increase the prices, and it does raise money for the Treasury. But the real deterrence is to persuade the corporate officers who have made the decisions that they're the ones who are going to be held accountable, not the shareholders.
Now, I read this book. It's well written. I liked it. But also, I know a lot of the characters in here. What's the thing you would say to younger folks that might induce them to read the book? Because the problem won't be they're reading it. It'll be persuading them to pick it up.
You know me a long time, right?
Right.
I'm not here to persuade anybody to read anything. And that, I'm happy to discuss all the issues.
But you would concede that it's good for young folks to be engaged in the issues that you raise here.
Well, I thought so. We're all egocentric. I thought my experiences in life might be interesting to others. But, I'm not comfortable.
Okay, advocating people should read it, okay?
Forgive me for that.
No, let me ask you this then. Of your experiences, and now you've only got 30 seconds to do this. This is very unfair. What's the one moment that stands out to you from your career as a prosecutor covered in this book that stands above all others as quintessentially reflecting what you stood for and what you believe in?
The day we liberated Hudson County from 70 years of total corruption, where even the public employees had to kick back their salaries, where nobody could work, where it was a dictatorship. It was immensely gratifying, and it occurred right on July 4th weekend. and it meant a lot to me.
I'm glad you're here to share that with us. I hope you'll come back again. I have a feeling there's another book along the way.
If I live long enough. Thank you, Ray.
And that's the kind of informed, in-depth talk you'll find here on Due Process. So our thanks to Judge Stern and to all of you for watching. For Raymond, our associate producer Tanya Ivanova, and all of us here, I'm Sandra King. We'll see you next time on Due Process.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and watch us on demand on YouTube.